Tonight you're not in your bed or on your phone. You're on a high white shoulder of the Urals where the wind has no manners, and the world is doing that quiet thing it does when it thinks no one is watching. Wind sands the ridge. Nylon snaps like a small flag and then hangs still again. Somewhere a match flares inside mitten hands, then thinks better of it and dies with a hiss. In that little pause between noises, you can let your shoulders sink and your jaw unclench. If you feel like it, you can also tell me where and what time are you listening from. Before you fall asleep, you'll walk once through the last camp on the slope, where everything looks almost boring until you notice what direction the tent is facing. You'll follow the line of footprints that don't quite break into a run, past the place where branches are broken high and a small fire once lived. And you'll watch the theories gather like weather fronts sew slabs. Strange sounds, human mistakes, each one trying to fit over the same set of tracks and never quite staying on. It's a story about a night that leaned too hard on a group of tired hikers, and about how a few meters of snow can turn into decades of questions. Out here, the details stay simple. The air tastes like metal and cold cloth. Canvas tightens and loosens with each gust. A watch under a sleeve ticks close to the skin, keeping time more faithfully than any diary. Somewhere beyond the dark ridge, a tram bell in another country thins into evening. Let one steady sound near you be the metronome, maybe a fan, maybe a clock, maybe your own breath. If it starts to set the pace, that's perfect. Inhale 4, exhale 6. The mountain isn't going anywhere. We'll follow the footprints one by one, and you can drift off whenever the snow decides you've heard enough. You might not expect a half-collapsed canvas tent in the Ural Mountains to generate decades of paperwork, but that is more or less what happened. The last camp on the slope was, at first glance, a very ordinary piece of winter inefficiency. A group of experienced hikers, the kind of people who thought of minus 20 degrees as crisp, set up their shelter on a shoulder of Kolat, Sayakal, where the wind had plenty of opinions. The snow there did not lie peacefully. It drifted, rearranged itself, and occasionally decided that horizontal travel was just as fun as vertical. Still, the tent went up, the stove was assembled, and wool socks migrated into neat rows like sleepy soldiers waiting for morning. In the photographs taken earlier that day, you can see them, boots and packs, carefully lined against the canvas wall, everything labeled by habit rather than ink. It looks less like the beginning of a mystery and more like a group project that is nearly finished. The choice of campsite has been analyzed in a way that most hillsides never enjoy. On maps and diagrams, people draw arrows for wind direction, annotate slopes in degrees, and circle spots where the snowpack might object to human activity. These reconstructions tend to forget that the original decision was probably made by tired young people who were cold, hungry, and slightly stubborn about reaching a target altitude. They were training for higher categories of hiking certification. They had rules to check off, distances to cover, boxes to tick. Stopping below the tree line, where wood for a fire was convenient and wind less aggressive, would have been comfortable but also slightly less impressive. So the tent went up in the open, with guy lines pinned into firm snow that did not ask for a vote. Inside the tent, the evening followed a rhythm that is almost boring in its predictability. Dinner was cooked on a portable stove, a small metal box that has now been diagrammed from every angle by people who will never have to light it in a blizzard. Journals were updated with notes about the route, minor complaints about the weather, and the kind of cheerful understatement that thrives when you cannot yet imagine anything going significantly wrong. Clothes damp from the day's march were hung along the central line to dry, turning the tent into a narrow hallway of sleeves and socks. At some point, someone probably reminded everyone to knock the snow off their boots before crawling inside. No one wrote that down because housekeeping rarely makes it into official records. Later, of course, investigators would come upon a very different scene. The tent was still there, but not the way its owners intended. It lay partially collapsed, one side embedded in snow, cuts visible in the canvas like long, uncertain decisions. These cuts are famous now in a quiet, persistent way. They have been measured, photographed, traced, argued over. Some say they look like frantic slashes made from the inside. Others insist they could just as easily be tidy openings made later by rescue teams trying to get in. The fabric itself has become a reluctant witness, dragged into conversations about panic, avalanches, and how people behave when woken at odd hours by unpleasant noises. Yet the objects left inside seem stubbornly calm. Boots, parkas, provisions, even a working stove, all the things you would normally take with you if you expected not to come back, remained on the snow floor arranged with the logic of the previous evening still intact. From that quiet disarray, the story walks away on human feet. This is where the famous footprints begin, stepping out of the torn tent into the night. For once, snow did what historians always beg it to do, but rarely does. It kept a record. The prints wandered down the slope in a loose, almost meandering line. They did not show the churned chaos you might expect from a desperate sprint. Instead, they looked like the tracks of people who had decided to walk in an orderly, if underdressed, procession. Some impressions suggested socks, others bare feet, a few the flat pattern of felt boots. The stride length was normal, the spacing inconsistent in an utterly human way. You can imagine people turning their heads to talk, slowing to look back, adjusting pace for a companion. For a short distance, the trail even passes around a small obstacle as if someone said, out of habit, let's go this way, and the rest simply followed. Rescuers who followed the line later reported an odd calm in the path. No one seemed to have fallen. There were no drag marks, no places where prints scattered wildly. The only abnormal thing was the obvious one. The walkers had left their heavy clothing and most of their equipment behind in the tent, which is rather like leaving your phone, coat, and keys on a cafe table and then strolling out into a snowstorm. It is technically possible, but you would likely have reasons, and those reasons might not look impressive in hindsight. Wind, darkness, unfamiliar sounds, the strange acoustics of a tent in a storm. These humble agents have been tested and retested in laboratories and computer models. They are the supporting cast in a drama famous for having no star. As the footprints continue downhill, the white of the open slope gradually gives way to the darker shapes of the forest. Here, the snow was deeper and broken not only by human steps, but by branches, trunks, and the occasional tree root committed to tripping the unwary. Along the tree line, investigators found evidence of small acts of survival that would have looked completely unremarkable in any winter camp had the context been less dramatic. Several branches high up were snapped, as if someone had climbed to break off wood or perhaps to scout from above. Under one large cedar, needles and bark lay disturbed where people had clearly stood or sat, shedding fragments of tree onto the snow, the way tired humans shedding patience. Tiny burn marks spotted nearby suggested that a modest fire had been coaxed into existence. The fire has its own miniature bibliography. At least 2 people seem to have stood close enough to singe clothing and skin, which implies they were cold enough to prefer the risk of scorching to the certainty of frostbite. Bits of fabric were later found nearby, caught on branches like quiet flags. Some of these pieces appear to have been torn from garments and repurposed as makeshift footwear or wrappings, the sort of improvisation rescue manuals politely recommend doing much earlier. It is easy, warm at home, to say what one should have done on that hillside. Wear more layers, stay with the tent, build a better fire. In the cold, decisions shrink. A small flame in a windy forest can feel like a thesis on optimism, even if, from above, it barely colors the snow. The woods at Dyatlov Pass behaved exactly as woods usually do. They muffled sound, broke the wind, and offered an ambiguous promise of shelter that depended entirely on how skillfully one rearranged their components. The broken branches and compacted snow under the cedar tell a very standard story. People tried to climb, to gather, to huddle, to burn what would burn. No one invented a new form of survival that night. They simply performed the usual steps under unusually uncooperative conditions. Forests do not have opinions about mysteries. They are good at hiding both competence and error with equal discretion. From footprints and fire, attention drifts inward to causes and explanations, which multiply over time like marginal notes. One family of theories speaks in the language of weather and physics. According to this view, the slope above the tent was not so much malevolent as slightly unstable. A layer of wind-packed snow, a slab, might have shifted after the group settled in, pressing against the side of the tent like a slow, heavy shoulder. Not a catastrophic avalanche that barrels down valleys in documentary footage, but a quieter, local movement that could crush one side of the shelter, jostle the supports, or threaten to. In such a scenario, cutting the tent to exit quickly while the snow still rearranged itself might have felt like an ordinary, almost boringly reasonable decision. Cold, in these explanations, is not an enemy that leaps. It is a patient editor of human choices. Step outside without boots to check the slope. Help a friend straighten a support pole. Decide, just for a moment, not to go back in. Each small choice, harmless on its own, converges in the way misplaced commas can eventually change the meaning of a sentence. Hypothermia is known for its ability to erode judgment gently. People start by making normal decisions, only slightly suboptimal, and repeat them until the sequence becomes fatal. Under this light, the line of footprints reads less like a clue from a thriller and more like a list of small errors walking downhill. Other theories prefer more dramatic company. They mention secret weapons tests, stray rockets, or experimental devices that might have produced infrasound, those low-frequency vibrations you cannot hear but can supposedly feel as unease. In some reconstructions, the tent becomes a wind instrument, howling in an invisible key that convinces everyone inside that something is dangerously wrong. In others, bright lights cross the sky because witnesses in nearby regions reported unusual glows in the atmosphere around that time. One can almost hear the mountain sigh as it is compulsorily cast as a stage for every unsolved phenomenon within 100 kilometers. These more colorful stories do an impressive job of circling back to the same old facts. Whether one imagines secret military tests, extraterrestrial tourists with bad timing, or a panicked flight from an avalanche that didn't quite happen, the physical traces remain stubbornly modest. A tent cut open, belongings left behind, footprints walking rather than running, a small fire, improvised clothing, bodies found at varying distances from the original camp. Each grand theory has to bend itself into shapes that accommodate these very ordinary clues. In the process, the strange magic of the place becomes less about any single explanation and more about the enduring refusal of the evidence to pick a favorite. The mountain itself, of course, does nothing. Its slopes accumulate and shed snow each winter with bureaucratic regularity. Wind maps drawn by meteorologists show the usual patterns of air curling around ridges, sliding down gullies, and occasionally misbehaving near passes. If you were to hike there with proper gear and a more conservative attitude toward campsite selection, the landscape would likely strike you as bleak but unremarkable. Yet, in the archives of armchair investigators, this same patch of earth has hosted invisible waves, rogue soldiers, creatures borrowed from folklore, and the full spectrum of human suspicion. It is an impressive workload for a hill whose biggest ambition may be to slowly erode. Eventually, all wandering theories like the footprints arrive at the paperwork. The original investigation into the deaths of the hikers produced a tidy stack of files written in the formal language of Soviet bureaucracy. Photographs of the tent, the bodies, the rescued items, and the surrounding terrain were collected and numbered. Statements from searchers and acquaintances were taken, stamped, and filed. The conclusion, essentially, that a compelling natural force had caused the tragedy, sounded simultaneously official and unsatisfying, like a weather report that admits it doesn't quite know which cloud did it. Over the years, the case was closed, revisited, reopened, reanalyzed, and politely placed back on the shelf more than once. Each new review added vocabulary rather than clarity. Forensic techniques improved, and people measured fractures and injuries with more precise rulers. Geologists studied snow layers, wind patterns, and slope stability. Engineers simulated slab avalanches on computer models that the original hikers, busy sewing their own gear, could hardly have imagined. Journalists wrote features. Documentary crews trudged into the snow with cameras. Tourists visited memorials and took selfies with clouds. The core facts, like old stones in a stream, remained where they were, while interpretations flowed around them in ever more complicated currents. In a way, the Dyatlov Pass incident has become a case study in how humans handle unanswered questions. We're good at generating possibilities, less good at filing them away. Some people are content with the idea that a combination of weather, terrain, and human misjudgment, essentially, the everyday ingredients of outdoor risk, arrange themselves in an unusually unfortunate sequence. Others prefer a mystery with sharper edges, one that promises a hidden villain or a suppressed truth. Between these two attitudes, the documents quietly thicken. If you are still very much awake at this point, congratulations. You have outlasted multiple official commissions. You could, if you wanted, scroll down, like, comment, subscribe, or invent your own theory involving experimental sled dogs. But you are also entirely free to do nothing, to let the story drift around you like low clouds over the ridge. The case will not notice either way. It is busy existing in filing cabinets, documentaries, and late-night discussions where someone inevitably says, "Well, we'll never really know," in the tone of voice reserved for both mysteries and misplaced socks. For bedtime purposes, it may help to imagine the whole affair as a library shelf rather than a crime scene. On that shelf sit folders labeled with cautiously worded findings, academic articles with titles heavy enough to serve as doorstops, and paperbacks sporting dramatic cover art where the wind always looks slightly more sinister than meteorology strictly requires. Next to them, perhaps, is a small box containing fragments. A scrap of canvas, a photograph of footprints, a diagram of the slope. None of these items on their own is particularly alarming. They are just components of a story that, through repetition and retelling, has been inflated and deflated many times over. Tomorrow, or the next night, someone cannot sleep and remembers that once, decades ago, 9 hikers did not make it home. The shelf will be visited again. Another article will be written. Another model will be run. Another explanation will walk carefully between the same fixed points on the map. The snow on the ridge will continue to fall in winter and melt in summer, caring nothing for the lines traced over it on paper. Above it, weather fronts will slide across satellites' fields of view, and occasionally, someone in a warm room will pause a video at the frame that shows the tent, half buried, and try to read meaning in the angle of a rope. For now, though, the most restful version of the story is also the least dramatic. A group of capable young people went into a difficult environment. They made choices that were reasonable from their point of view and imperfect in hindsight. The mountain and the weather behaved within normal parameters, but not generous ones. The results were tragic for those involved and strangely productive for everyone's curiosity. History has turned this event into a snow globe of unsolved questions. We pick it up, shake it, watch the tiny flakes swirl, and then set it back down. None the wiser, but slightly more awake than we meant to be. As your eyes grow heavier, you can let the footprints fade a little. Imagine the line of steps on the slope slowly being covered by new snow, the edges softening until they become just faint shadows. The tent's cuts are mended, in your mind at least, with neat stitches that hold against the wind. The forest at the tree line stands still, its broken branches quietly regrowing in a season that never quite arrives. Somewhere, a drawer of documents closes with a muted click. The mountain, having hosted enough speculation for one night, returns to being what most mountains are, a slightly lumpy arrangement of rock and ice under a changing sky. And if there are still questions left open, they can wait patiently in the cold, while you drift very gently somewhere much warmer. You might not expect a heap of forgotten umbrellas to need their own bureaucracy, but Victorian railways were very serious about people misplacing things. In the middle of a city that was constantly in motion, there were a few quiet rooms where motion stopped, at least for objects. Somewhere behind a station facade of soot-darkened stone, past ticket offices and waiting rooms and the smell of coal, there was a door marked with something very modest like lost property. It rarely slammed. It opened and closed with the mild patience of a clerk's hand, hour after hour, year after year, admitting the endless trickle of items that people had accidentally donated to the railway. If you're still awake by the time we reach the section about unclaimed false teeth, you're welcome to subscribe or follow, or simply remember where you left your own belongings. But please don't strain yourself. The office will continue to exist perfectly well without any effort from you. Inside, the first impression was shelves. Shelves with boxes with labels. Labels with handwriting that had long since given up on style and settled into a very legible sort of exhaustion. The railway companies prided themselves on punctuality, but the lost property office ran on a slower clock. Time there was measured not in arrival and departure, but in how many days an umbrella had been waiting for a name, or how long a pair of gloves had been separated from their owner's fingers. The shelves at eye level usually held the more common items: hats, walking sticks, small parcels wrapped in paper and string whose knots had outlived their original purpose. Higher up were heavier things, suitcases, whose handles bore the permanent groove of being lifted at least once too often. Valises that smelled faintly of soap, and occasionally something that resisted classification, like a stuffed parrot or a violin case that contained no violin, only sheet music and 2 boiled sweets. The air smelled of dust, ink, and the faintest echo of other people's journeys. Every item carried a trace of where it had been: a coal smudge from a carriage window, a trace of perfume from an overcoat, sand in the corner of a travel bag from some forgotten seaside. None of these clues were strictly necessary. The clerks preferred tags and ticket numbers to the romantic language of stains. Still, the objects insisted on having histories, and if you looked at them long enough, they started to tell very slow stories. A battered carpet bag with a church newsletter poking out suggested a Sunday trip that ended in a hurried exit. A child's tin soldier, found alone between seats, hinted that someone fell asleep during a long journey and woke up minus 1 small infantryman. The path an item took from the carriage to those shelves was surprisingly ceremonial in its own humble way. When a train reached its terminus and passengers poured out with the usual mixture of impatience and relief, another rhythm began behind them. Porters and cleaners walked through each compartment, picking up what the passengers had forgotten in their determination to be somewhere else. A cloak here, a newspaper there, a small box carefully placed on the overhead rack, and then cheerfully betrayed by the memory that put on gloves, but did not look up. Some items were identified immediately and run after, producing short sprints through crowded platforms and breathless calls of, "Sir," "Madam," "Your bag." Those items do not make history. The more interesting ones, from our slow and sleepless point of view, are the things whose owners had already dissolved into the city before anyone found them. These orphaned objects were taken to a small counter where they were entered into a ledger. The ledger was the true heart of the office, thick, heavy, and determined not to be excited by anything. Each line had its columns, date, train number, where the item was found, what exactly it was, any distinguishing marks. And eventually, if fortune was feeling organized, the name of the person who claimed it. The clerks became experts in describing things in ways that were precise but oddly unflattering. A hat was rarely stylish. It was felt dark, somewhat worn. A parasol was greenish ribbed, slightly bent. Sometimes, when a clerk had slept badly or enjoyed an extra cup of tea, the adjectives crept toward quiet amusement. Umbrella, black, handle carved into what appears to be a dog of uncertain breed. The ledger tolerated such flourishes as long as they did not interfere with the practical business of identification. For the first few days after arrival, an item existed in a state of heightened possibility. Perhaps its owner would realize the loss quickly, hurry back to the station, and appear at the counter with a mixture of embarrassment and relief. The clerks were familiar with the look, a kind of apologetic hopefulness, as if the person were asking not only for their belongings, but also for permission to pretend this never happened. With calm efficiency, the staff would ask for a description, consult the ledger, retrieve the object from its shelf, and produce a form to sign. Ownership was proved less by documents than by how accurately one could describe the thing in question. People who truly knew their umbrella could identify a repaired rib, a small tear in the fabric, or the exact shade of a handle. Those who hesitated were sometimes gently tested, and inside the case are how many spoons? Not everything was as straightforward as cloth and wood. The Victorian tendency to travel while carrying half of one. Worldly goods meant that the Lost Property Office accumulated items that felt like extensions of their owners' personalities. Spectacles were common, which raises the practical question of how people managed to notice they had lost the very tools they used to see. Pocket diaries turned up, containing lists of appointments and occasionally very mild secrets, the kind that made clerks raise an eyebrow and then lower it again out of professional politeness. There were bundles of letters tied with ribbon, never opened, because the office's duties stopped at identification, not curiosity. Yet, even unopened, such bundles added a low hum of possible drama to the shelves, like distant thunder that never gets any closer. Then there were the objects that the staff, with the impassive kindness of bureaucrats, categorized simply as miscellaneous. Artificial limbs arrived more often than you might imagine. Dentures, too, carefully wrapped in handkerchiefs, as if their owners had meant to keep them safe, but were defeated by the distraction of a changing platform. On one memorable occasion, a railway company reported receiving a full-size grandfather clock. Traveling with a luggage tag, but no person, the clock completed its journey on time. The owner did not. Such items required extra paragraphs in the ledger because no one felt comfortable writing one leg without explanation. Months slid past in that slow, procedural way that paperwork prefers. Each company had its own rules about how long to keep unclaimed items. Some waited 3 months, others a full year. During that period, objects slumbered on shelves while notices were pasted in newspapers or pinned in station corridors. The language of these advertisements was modestly frantic. Found on the 8:15 to Paddington, a package containing garments. Owner may reclaim upon proper description. It sounds like the calling of names in a classroom where the students are coats and umbrellas waiting to raise their hands. Most never did. People moved houses, forgot journeys, or decided that the effort required to track down a misplaced walking stick outweighed its sentimental value. It is surprisingly easy, when life continues, to make peace with the absence of an object that once felt essential. When the retention period expired, the Lost Property Office shifted roles. It became briefly a sort of shop, though one that you had to be very determined to find. Unclaimed items were auctioned off, usually in bulk. Notices announced sales of surplus articles in language that avoided words like abandoned. Dealers and curious members of the public would inspect rows of anonymous belongings laid out on tables. There's something quietly democratic about such auctions. A silk hat and a plain cap might end up side by side, stripped of their original owner status. The proceeds went into company coffers or, occasionally, to charity funds established for retired railway workers. In this way, a lost glove could, in a very indirect manner, contribute to the pension of the porter who might once have picked it up. The clerks themselves led oddly parallel lives to the objects they handled. Their days were divided into small, carefully logged actions: receive, describe, shelve, retrieve, return, or, if all else failed, prepare for disposal. They worked surrounded by evidence of other people's carelessness, yet their job required almost obsessive order. Many developed a kind of professional sixth sense for the human habits behind the items. They could tell, from the style of a walking stick, whether its owner was likely to come back for it. They knew that a child's toy left behind would usually be reclaimed within 24 hours, accompanied by a parent whose expression mixed desperation with the knowledge that the child had not stopped talking about the missing bear since the moment it was noticed. By contrast, umbrellas left on sunny days were rarely claimed at all, which suggests something about both the British weather and the human capacity for optimistic amnesia. In quieter moments, when the last morning rush of frantic claimants had ebbed, the office settled into a deeper stillness. One clerk might sit at a high desk, dipping a pen into an inkwell and updating the ledger in a neat looping hand. Another might move among the shelves, rearranging items so that newer arrivals did not block the older ones from whatever metaphysical exit they were waiting for. A clock ticked. Somewhere in the building, a train whistle sounded, but it reached this room only as a faint, distant note, like a memory of travel rather than travel itself. The lost property office was the pause between journeys, the place where momentum became inventory. If you imagine yourself there, standing quietly so as not to disturb the paperwork, you might notice how time feels slightly padded in that space. Each object is a bookmark left in the story of a day that has already been read. The items do not know, of course, that they are being separated from their narratives, but humans feel it, which is why we are so oddly sentimental about our possessions. A hat is not just cloth and thread. It is the hat one wore to a particular interview, or a picnic, or the first day of snow. When clerks in the lost property office wrote "hat black," they were being efficient. Somewhere, a person remembered it as the hat I lost the day I missed my connection. Both descriptions were accurate, but only one could fit in the column. Over the years, as railway systems modernized and trains changed from steam to diesel and beyond, the principle of the lost property office remained much the same. New technologies arrived: telephone inquiries, typed forms, eventually computers. Yet at its core, the process still involved someone picking up a forgotten item, someone else writing it down, in a quiet room where things waited for people who might or might not come back. Modern offices deal with laptops, headphones, and an impressive number of water bottles, but the spirit of the Victorian ledgers lingers on in database fields labeled description and date found. Somewhere a clerk, now armed with barcode scanners instead of ink, still has to decide whether a bag should be described as blue or blue-green. Bureaucracies, like coats, change their fabric more easily than their shape. By now you may notice your thoughts drifting a little, like luggage left on a slowly moving carousel. That is the natural effect of spending time among misplaced objects. Nothing in this story asks for urgency. There are no villains, only absent-mindedness and timetables. The most dramatic scene is perhaps a man realizing, halfway home, that his portfolio of papers is not under his arm, and then the quiet relief of finding it 3 days later behind a glass window labeled "Inquiries." Even the office's rare curiosities, the occasional live chicken, the mysterious trunk that no one claims, are carefully processed into the same soothing routine: log, store, decide. In the end, what makes the history of railway lost property oddly satisfying for bedtime is its gentle assurance that the world is full of second chances for things, even when people forget them. Hats wait on hooks, umbrellas lean politely in corners, Suitcases sit with their buckles fastened, all of them expecting that someone might yet walk through the door and say, with a mixture of apology and recognition, "Oh, there you are." Sometimes that happens. Often it does not. Either way, the shelves are ready. The ledger opens to a new page. Another entry joins the long, quiet list of dates, objects, and places where somebody, briefly distracted, put something down and walked away. As you drift towards sleep, you can imagine the office at closing time. The last claimant has gone, carrying a recovered parcel or a replacement ticket. The clerks cap their inkwells, or, in later years, shut down their typewriters and computers. Items that have not yet reached the end of their official waiting period stay where they are, obedient to the small universe of rules that governs them. Light from a single gas lamp, or a bulb, or a modern strip fixture falls across shelves of patient belongings. Outside, trains continue to arrive and depart, but their noise reaches this room only as a soft, distant murmur. Inside, pens lie beside ledgers, and tomorrow's entries sleep unwritten. Somewhere on a carriage seat, at this very moment, someone is probably forgetting a scarf. The system is ready for it, and you, unlike the scarf, are not required to remember anything at all. You might not expect wooden benches to have a financial history, but for a few centuries, church seating was basically real estate with hymn books. In a world before streaming, before plastic chairs, and before the concept of general admission, people did not just wander into a church and sit wherever they liked. They sat where they paid to sit, or more accurately, where someone in their family had once paid to sit, and then carefully not forgotten about it for several generations. The pew beneath you could tell you exactly who you were, or at least who you could afford to be, right down to the brass number on the end. If you're still awake by the time we get to the part where pews are auctioned like mildly holy parking spaces, you are very welcome to subscribe, follow, or simply reserve your usual spot in this little corner of boring history. But really, don't hurry. Unlike 19th century parishioners, you will not lose your place if you drift off for a while. It begins very quietly, as these things often do with standing. In medieval churches, there were almost no permanent seats. People stood during long services, leaning against pillars if they were lucky, or sat on portable stools they brought from home. The elderly and sick might be given a bench along the wall. The origin of the phrase, "the weakest go to the wall," which is not as encouraging as it sounds. Over time, as sermons grew longer and backs grew less enthusiastic, simple benches began to appear. They were movable at first, more like furniture than architecture, and nobody argued much about who owned what. But then someone's name was carved into one, and that was the beginning of the problem. A bench with a name stops being just a place to sit and starts being a place that belongs. By the 17th and 18th centuries, in many European and North American churches, seating had quietly evolved into a system of rented boxes. Pews became little wooden enclosures with doors, sometimes with cushions and footstools, and occasionally with small coal heaters that threatened the pious with both comfort and minor fire hazard. Families paid annual fees to claim a specific pew, which would be theirs for every service, every wedding, every funeral, and the occasional nap disguised as prayerful reflection. The closer the pew was to the pulpit or to the stove in winter, the higher the price. It was this spiritual version of airline seating. More money got you closer to the front and slightly warmer. At Christmas services, you could look across the nave and read the income distribution of the entire town in neat, varnished rows. The administration of all this sitting required surprising amounts of paperwork. Parish vestries kept ledgers listing each pew, its number, its location, and the name of the person responsible for paying its rent. Some entries were simple. Pew 14, Mr. John Baker, Baker. Others needed extra lines to explain complicated arrangements, such as a pew shared between two families, alternating Sundays like a very slow-moving timeshare. Payments were recorded with tidy check marks, small symbols proving that yet another year of sitting rights had been secured. Behind the calm of Sunday morning lay a network of tiny contracts, as if every backside had signed a lease. Pew rent was not simply about comfort. It was about funding things. Church maintenance cost money, and in an age before casual fundraising emails, parishes leaned heavily on these annual seating fees. The roof, the candles, the organ, the occasional repainting of a saint's robe, all of it could be traced in part to pews. A new organ might even be described in the accounts as funded by the choir gallery and 4 rows nearest the pulpit, which is a very polite way of saying that people who wanted better acoustics also ended up paying for them. In some places, if you follow the money carefully enough, you could argue that the choir hit their notes because Mrs. Thompson in Pew 7 never missed a payment. Of course, whenever money and seating meet, hierarchy follows close behind with the measuring tape. Families competed, quietly and sometimes not so quietly, for the best placed pews. Old families guarded their inherited seats as proof that they had belonged to the parish before anyone had thought to count time properly. New money tried to edge its way forward, sometimes literally, by improving a pew with fresh cushions or taller paneling. In extreme cases, partitions grew so high that the congregation resembled a collection of wooden boxes listening to a disembodied sermon. A 19th century visitor once remarked that entering a certain church felt like walking into a maze of polite fortifications, each pew a little domestic fort where people could worship without the distraction of seeing one another. The disputes this system produced were, from a distance, gently absurd. Vestry minutes record arguments about inches of space, as families claimed that the person in the next pew had encroached past the invisible frontier. The pew line with their elbows, hats, or hymn books. Sometimes the boundary issue involved feet, especially when someone as boots poked under the partition onto the next family as carefully swept floor. There were complaints about visitors daring to sit in rented places, usually handled with firm but quiet shuffling rather than open confrontation. The most serious offenders were people who, either through ignorance or boldness, slid into the front pews without realizing they were stepping into the social equivalent of someone's drawing room. Ushers became part-time diplomats, gently relocating such souls with the kind of smile that says, "God welcomes everyone, but Mrs. Wilkins pays for this space." Auctions added another layer of calm drama. When a parish needed extra funds, it might announce that certain pews were available to the highest bidder for the coming year. The event was rarely exciting in a cinematic sense. It involved a clerk, a list, a gavel, and several people trying to look indifferent while calculating exactly how much closer they could afford to be to the front. Bids crept upward, sometimes by single shillings, as families weighed their budgets against their desire not to be stuck behind a pillar. Occasionally, a very determined person would dramatically outbid everyone else for a prime pew, only to spend the next 12 months pretending this was entirely normal and not at all a statement. It was social mobility, but in slow motion and with hymn numbers. The poor, of course, had their own arrangement. In many churches, the gallery or the back rows were left free, meaning unreserved seating for those who could not pay. These areas were rarely the warmest and often required climbing narrow staircases that discouraged late arrivals. Some parishes, in a burst of experimental fairness, created pews specifically labeled for the poor, which achieved the rare feat of being both charitable and slightly awkward at the same time. Others used small wooden tokens, simple discs or squares stamped with numbers, to distribute free places among the less prosperous. You received a token from the church wardens, turned up on Sunday, and sat where the number told you to sit, which may be history's sleep-based form of assigned seating. Not all pews were rigidly rectangular. In certain maritime towns, you could find pews customized for specific trades. There were fishermen's pews near the door for quick exits when the tide waited for no sermon. In a few places, there were narrow pews for apprentices, long enough to hold a row of young men who were expected to absorb both doctrine and the example of their masters' backs. Some rural churches had so-called horsemen's pews, positioned so those who lived far away and arrived late due to the state of the roads could slip in quietly. The details varied, but everywhere the church interior became a sort of wooden map of the community, its occupations and its small compromises with time. As centuries passed and religious reformers grew uncomfortable with the idea that access to the front of a church could be rented like a stall at market, pew systems began to feel old-fashioned. Critics argued that charging people to sit near the pulpit contradicted the notion of spiritual equality. Pamphlets appeared with titles that included words like free and open, which in this context meant that seating should be unrestricted, not that people would no longer fall asleep mid-sermon. Campaigns were launched to abolish pew rents and throw open the doors, allowing anyone to sit wherever they wished, subject only to the laws of punctual arrival and personal shyness. Removing the old pew structures was, somewhat fittingly, a slow and methodical job. Carpentry that had taken decades to build was dismantled with care, though not always with regret. Auction notices appeared again, this time selling off the wood itself. Pews to be removed and disposed of, useful for sheds and outbuildings. In some villages, fragments of church pews went on to lead second lives as tool racks. Henhouse walls, or garden benches, carrying faint traces of varnish and hymn numbers into the practical outdoor world. Expressive panel carvings, once facing the pulpit, ended up watching over cabbages. It is one of history's quiet ironies that the most exclusive seating in town eventually became somewhere to lean a rake. Yet, even as pew rents faded, the habit of claiming a particular spot did not vanish. Congregations, freed from official assignments, immediately began to sit in the same places out of sheer custom. Humans, it seems, like knowing where they belong, even when nobody writes it down. Ask a regular churchgoer today where they sit, and they will be able to point to their pew with the certainty of an 18th century ledger. Even though no money changes hands, latecomers who accidentally occupy these unofficial territories are still gently redirected, though now the explanation is more likely to be, we always sit here, rather than we pay for this. The social script is softer, but the choreography of Sunday morning remains surprisingly similar. The story of pew rents might sound abstract, but it is stitched into countless tiny rituals. The act of arriving early to dust a family pew before others arrived. The habit of leaving hymn books or a small Bible in the rack, confident no one else would claim them. Children tracing fingers along the grain of the wood, learning from its knots and scratches which corner belonged to them. These gestures, repeated week after week, turned simple wooden enclosures into something like time capsules. When records show that Pew 23 belonged to the same family for 50 or 100 years, they are quietly acknowledging dozens of births, funerals, harvest Thanksgivings, and ordinary Sundays sheltered by the same panels. If you imagine slipping into one of those pews now, long after the rent books have closed, you might notice how still the story has become. The brass number is dull, the cushions gone or flattened, but the sense of assigned space lingers like an old habit that no one quite got around to canceling. The sermons that once justified the cost have evaporated into the air. The arguments about inches of floorboard have lost their urgency. What remains is the gentle absurdity of an era when people paid not only to listen, but to sit in exactly the same place while doing so. It is a reminder that even in matters of the soul, someone once had to draw a seating plan. And as you let your thoughts drift, you might feel the whole system becoming pleasantly blurry. Ledger pages turn more slowly, ink fades, pew doors silently swing open, and the boundaries between my seat and your seat dissolve into plain wooden benches again. Somewhere, a clerk with a very neat handwriting lays down their pen, satisfied that every place has been accounted for, at least for another year. The church is empty now, save for dust motes moving lazily in the light, settling where they please without any concern for numbers or rents. The benches wait, as they always have, and history quiet, patient, and slightly amused keeps their stories in reserve, like seats that will always be there, whether anyone remembers to sit in them or not. You might not think that a neat row of footprints in the snow could keep whole offices of people occupied for more than 60 years, but here we are still measuring them in our minds like very cold shoe salesmen. The Dyatlov Pass incident is usually told as a mystery, with capital letters and eerie pauses, but if you tilt your head slightly and let the drama slide off, what remains is largely a story about camping equipment, weather reports, and paperwork that refused to retire. Tonight, we are not here to solve anything. We are only here to watch a tent being pitched a little higher than it should, to follow some very patient footprints and to listen to the gentle rustling sound of investigation files being opened-closed and then opened again because someone misfiled a photograph. If by the time I get to the part where an investigator writes, height of footprint, approximately 31 centimeters, for the third time, you're still awake. You're very welcome to subscribe or follow, or just mentally reserve your own little snowprint in this channel of boring history. But if you drift off somewhere between the stove inventory and the snowpack description, that is honestly the better outcome. It begins with a slope that is not especially dramatic until people insist on camping on it. The Dyatlov group, trained and methodical, climbs into the Urals with the same level of organization that some people bring to color-coding their kitchen shelves. They carry forms, maps, multiple pairs of socks, a portable stove, and a logbook in which they write things like, started late, weather tolerable, spirits high. It is the tone of people who believe that as long as they write sensibly, the world will behave sensibly. The last camp they choose is on the shoulder of Kalatsayakal, a name that means dead mountain, which sounds ominous until you remember that mountains are not known for their lively personalities anyway. The spot they pick is a little exposed, a little windy, but it saves them the trouble of descending into the forest and climbing back up in the morning. Efficiency, as every tired hiker knows, is more tempting than comfort. They pitch the tent carefully, in the approved manner, driving skis into the snow as anchors, stacking gear along the sides, creating a long tunnel of canvas where sleep and damp socks will coexist. Nothing about this is cinematic. It is the ordinary rhythm of setting up camp. Pack down the snow, align the tent with the wind, check the guy lines, debate briefly about whose turn it is to cook. Someone probably notices that the slope feels steeper than ideal, but the day is fading and the priorities become simpler. Get the stove going. Melt water, write a couple of lines in the diary to prove that the day happened. From the outside, the tent looks like any other high-altitude shelter, a small decision folded into fabric. From the inside, it is just cramped warmth, the smell of felt boots and stew. Later, people will stand by the same slope and talk about angles. Was the tent pitched on a gradient of 15 degrees, or 20, or steep enough to be annoying but not enough to cancel the trip? In reports, the numbers march across the page. Slope angle, snow depth, distance to the ridge. Experts draw small triangles and arrows, explaining how wind-packed snow layers can slide or simply stay put depending on temperature and stubbornness. The more carefully they calculate, the more everything begins to sound like a physics problem that wandered outside for a moment and lost its way. Yet at the time, the campers are not thinking about hypothetical slab avalanches. They are thinking about who has to go out to check the guy lines in the dark if the wind picks up, and whether there is still enough sugar for morning tea. It is the sort of practical focus that makes survival possible and, at the same time, sometimes forgets to read all the small print in the weather. When the search teams arrive days later, they find the tent collapsed but still partially standing, like a tired animal that had finally given up on posture. What draws attention is the long cut in the side, slanting from top to bottom. Later analysis suggests it was made from the inside. To investigators, this is instantly interesting because ordinary people usually prefer zippers. The material is tough, the knives are sharp, and the cut slices through both canvas and routine. Inside lie boots, clothing, food, and notebooks, left behind in arrangements that look almost polite. It is as if the tent had been vacated in a hurry, but not in a panic. More like people answering an unexpectedly urgent knock at the door than fleeing a collapsing roof. Over the years, this detail will be underlined so often that the paper beneath it grows thin. The tent was not destroyed by snow or wind. It was opened intentionally by the people inside. This is either deeply mysterious or simply a very bad moment in which everyone decided, without discussion, that outside was safer than in. From here, the story walks away on its own feet, literally. The footprints leaving the tent move downslope in a quiet, almost orderly pattern. Searchers trace them one by one, noting that some impressions show socks, some show bare feet, some show the rubber tread of felt boots. The path is not a stampede. It is more like a loosely spaced group stroll, the kind you might see when people are heading to a bus stop and no one is late. Investigators bend over each mark, measuring length and depth, and writing in their notebooks phrases that repeat with hypnotic regularity. Footprints of 9 people, distance between prints, direction toward the forest. The snow has preserved these small decisions more faithfully than any diary entry. What is oddly soothing in all this is how calm the footprints appear. They do not break into a run. They do not tingle or overlap in a way that suggests chaos. They proceed patiently down toward the tree line. Some steps appear shorter, as if someone slowed to look back. Others are slightly deeper, where a person might have shifted weight or stumbled. But overall, the line feels like a conversation without words, everyone agreeing silently on the pace. If someone had announced, "We will go down there, to the trees, together," the snow heard and remembered, even after the words evaporated. The prints stay readable for days, enough time for them to be photographed, sketched, and explained again and again to people who were not there. At the edge of the forest, the trail dissolves into broken branches and scattered items. There is a small fire site by a cedar tree. Its charred remains carefully noted in reports. Remains of a fire. Height of burned branches, 4 to 5 meters above ground. This detail fascinates investigators because it implies climbing, probably without gloves. The cedar carries marks where branches were snapped off to feed the fire. The trunk becomes a vertical archive of those chilly, determined minutes. Beneath it lie bits of clothing, a few crumbs of food, and the remnants of the fire itself, which must have burned just long enough to leave embers and not long enough to solve the problem of the night. It is not a heroic fire, not the sort that lights up paintings. It is a practical, makeshift attempt to convert frozen wood and human breath into a few degrees of comfort. Nearby, other remains of activity appear in the snow and under branches, improvised shelters, attempts at building a snow den, traces of people dividing up clothing in ways that make the later analytical mind ache with their logic and their limits. Coats appear on the wrong bodies, boots are traded or abandoned, socks layered to the point of absurdity. It is the wardrobe equivalent of musical chairs, except that, when the investigators arrive, the music has clearly stopped long ago. For those cataloging the scene, every scrap becomes a clue, and every clue becomes an entry on a list. They number items, weigh them, and assign them positions on maps drawn so carefully that the hillside begins to look like a board game. After the bodies are found and the first wave of fieldwork ends, the cold part of the story moves into warm rooms. Now we enter the phase dominated by tables, charts, and typewritten pages. The Dyatlov case files grow thick as winter layers. Witness testimonies, route plans, weather reports, autopsy notes written and precise, and personal language of Soviet bureaucracy. Each page attempts to compress something complicated into a stable sentence. Cause of death, hypothermia, appears so often that it develops the rhythm of a refrain. Where injuries are unusual, they are described in long, steady paragraphs that do their best not to speculate. The tone is that of people who know they are not supposed to guess, yet cannot help leaving small, tidy questions in the margins of their wording. Theories begin to swirl around the case almost immediately, and over the decades, they accumulate like layers of paper in the archive. The most straightforward explanations start with the environment itself. A slab of wind-packed snow slipping onto the tent could have made a heavy, startling impact without burying the site completely. A sudden loud thump, a deformation of canvas, the suggestion reel, or imagine that more might follow. Such a scenario does not require elaborate conspiracies, only the human habit of reacting quickly when something large and cold appears to be entering your bedroom. In this telling, the cut in the tent is less a ritual of mystery and more a practical emergency exit created by people whose hands knew knives better than zippers and gloves. Other environmental factors join the list. Infrasound, for instance, becomes a fashionable suspect for a while. Certain wind patterns over the mountain, some researchers suggest, could have created low-frequency vibrations that the human ear cannot quite hear, but the human nervous system finds deeply unhelpful. Under such pressure, people might feel irrational dread and choose to leave a seemingly safe tent in the hope that outside feels better. Whether this is what actually happened or not, it does give the case a strangely modern twist. The mountain as an overenthusiastic subwoofer, the tent as a vibrating speaker, anxiety the hikers as listeners who finally decide they have had enough of the playlist. Still, simplicity does not have a strong lobby in matters of mystery. Alternative stories sprout like frost patterns on glass. Some point to military tests, secret weapons, the accidental witnessing of something classified in a landscape that did not appreciate spectators. Others invoke Yeti, aliens, or supernatural forces, more often seen in late-night television than in forensic reports. Each theory rearranges the same basic facts: the tent, the footprints, the tree line, the injuries like pieces of a puzzle that technically fit together in many different ways, if you are willing to ignore the picture on the box. The more narratives are proposed, the more the mountain itself seems to shrug, keeping its snow cover politely uninformative. What is gently comic, in a very quiet way, is how each new explanation often requires just one more adjustment. If a snow slab is responsible, then the angle of the slope must be reevaluated. If military testing is behind it, then the dates of rocket launches must be cross-checked. If panic from infrasound is to blame, then someone has to calculate wind speeds decades after the fact using incomplete meteorological logs. Specialists turn the case into graphs and diagrams, adding axes and arrows until the ridge looks less like a landscape and more like a math problem. Meanwhile, the original tent, boots, and stoves remain stubbornly non-theoretical in photographs frozen mid-use. Speaking of photographs, the group left behind several rolls of film, which investigators developed with care. The images show hikers smiling, adjusting gear, visiting local villages, and crossing snowy passes with the kind of resigned cheer that only comes from carrying heavy loads for a very long time. The final frames are endlessly examined. A blurry streak of light in the sky is zoomed in on until it becomes more grain than sky. A figure standing by the tent is analyzed for posture, expression, and possible hidden meaning, despite the fact that it mostly resembles someone trying not to squint at the wind. These photos, intended as simple trip memories, are rerouted into evidence, their original purpose quietly overwritten by our need to read significance into every shadow. In dusty offices, the case files rest in cardboard folders stamped with dates and reference numbers. Over time, they are reopened by different generations of officials, journalists, and curious visitors. Each time this happens, someone has to read through the same statements again. We found the tent. The prints moved downhill. Weather conditions were... The repetitive nature of these lines begins to feel almost meditative. Even the investigators become characters in the archive, their signatures recurring like familiar footnotes, the same handwriting attesting, once more, that the snow was deep, that the wind was strong, that the exact sequence of events remains unclear. The bureaucracy of not knowing can be remarkably thorough. Every so often, the case is officially revisited. New forensic techniques are applied. Modern avalanche models are run on computers that hum quietly instead of howling like mountain winds. Reports are revised, conclusions are updated from unknown to most likely environmental, and press releases announce that the mystery is, if not fully solved, then at least strongly suggested into one particular corner. Yet within a few years, new documentaries appear, fresh podcasts are recorded, and the same photographs circulate again with updated captions. The paperwork may lean toward one explanation, but the cultural imagination resists closure. It prefers the open tent, the line of footprints, the unfinished sentence. If you slowly step back from all the theories, what remains is a more modest human story. A group of experienced young people planned a winter trek, gathered their gear with care, obtained stamps of approval from sports committees, and set off into a landscape they had every reason to believe they could handle. They wrote jokes in their logbook, including a mock newspaper, Evening with Torton, complete with playful headlines. They posed for photos with skis and improvised banners. Their preparations were routine, almost boring in their thoroughness. The unusual thing about them is not what they did, but what followed. And even that is unusual, mostly because we cannot fold it neatly into a single column on a form. The mountain, for its part, remains exactly where it was, its slopes changing only in the slow ways that mountains change. A little more erosion here, a slight shift in snowpack patterns there. Hikers still traverse the area, some out of genuine love for winter trekking, others out of curiosity about the case. They pitch tents, check weather forecasts, and cook over stoves that are lighter and more efficient than the ones in 1959. Many of them will go to sleep on that same plateau and wake up to a perfectly ordinary morning, proving by their existence that the slope is not cursed or inherently lethal, only indifferent. It is the same indifference shown by all mountains, whether we remember their names or not. In the end, the Dyatlov Pass mystery is as much about our need to tidy up events as it is about what actually happened on that particular night. The more we smooth the wrinkles in our timelines, the more this story insists on keeping one small fold. Investigators can measure footprints, theorists can model snow slabs, storytellers can add atmospheric punctuation, but there will always be one missing sentence, one unrecorded conversation in the tent. Perhaps that is why the case lingers, not because it is uniquely strange, but because it is just strange enough to resist being filed under solved in the cabinet of human confidence. And so, as you either listening, you can imagine the whole scene gradually becoming very quiet. The wind on the ridge settles into a soft, constant hum. The footprints, once sharp, soften and blur under fresh snow. The tent, the cedar tree, the small fire, the taped-up case files in their boxes, all of them fade into a kind of patient stillness. Nothing moves quickly anymore, not the investigators, not the theories, not the mountain. The story continues only as a gentle drift of details. A slope angle here, a boot size there, a line in a diary note about someone forgetting to fix a button. It is an unfinished narrative, but also an unhurried one, content to stay slightly open, like a trail disappearing into white until, eventually, even the footprints of our thoughts grow lighter and lose their edges in the snow. You might not expect the most carefully guarded object in the world to be a small metal cylinder that mostly sat in the dark and quietly gained dust, but that is more or less what happened. Somewhere outside Paris for more than a century. A lump of platinum iridium slept under bell jars while very patient people worried about it changing by a few micrograms. Tonight, we're going to think about that cylinder and its many cousins, and about the long, drowsy project of deciding how heavy 1 kilogram is allowed to be. If you're still awake by the time we reach the part about polishing the weights with special cloth, you can subscribe if you like. But really, if you're asleep by then, that's a much better use of your time. Imagine a quiet laboratory near the end of the 19th century. The corridors are chilly, the walls are thick, and someone is walking very slowly because they're carrying something that must not be dropped. It's not a crown or a relic or a secret treaty. It's a little metal cylinder about the size of a plum, wrapped in cloth and anxiety. Technicians open nested boxes with the careful rhythm of a tea ceremony. Wood case, velvet lining, brass clasp. Then the innermost chamber, 3 glass bell jars stacked like transparent helmets, each one lifted straight up so that no dust decides to land. Under the last bell, on a tiny pedestal, sits the international prototype kilogram, the thing that, by definition, was exactly 1 kilogram. Not about a kilogram, not measured to be a kilogram. It was the kilogram. Everything else had to negotiate. The cylinder was an alloy of platinum and iridium, which sounds glamorous, but is mostly an excuse to say the words platinum iridium in reports. The proportion was 90% platinum, 10% iridium, a mix chosen because it doesn't tarnish easily, doesn't rust, and resists the urge to deform when people look at it too intensely. People still worried, of course. Scientists worry the way cats shed, constantly, and in small floating amounts. They wondered if the metal might absorb gas from the air. They wondered if microscopic dust might settle on it and pretend to be part of the definition of mass. Somewhere, inevitably, someone wondered whether microscopic fragments might be flaking off every time it was touched, turning the floor sweepings of the lab into contraband fractions of the universe's standard weight. Around this lonely cylinder, an entire ritual grew. Access was limited to a few officials with keys and white gloves. When it was time to compare it to its official copies, they scheduled the event like a small, extremely polite heist. The bell jars came off, the weight was lifted with tweezers that looked like miniature tongs, and everyone breathed as though air molecules themselves might push the scale. It took hours. The balances used were so sensitive that even a slight temperature difference between one side and the other could look like a change in mass. So the room waited to reach equilibrium. The people did too. They sat and noted the humidity and made small talk about expansion coefficients, which is a very safe topic because nobody has strong feelings about it. The original kilogram did not live alone. Like an anxious monarch, it had a set of officially recognized twins called sister copies stored in nearby safes. Around the world, national metrology institutes ordered their own versions. France had copies of the kilogram. Britain had copies of the kilogram. Germany, the United States, Russia, Japan, everyone who wanted to weigh anything seriously eventually sent ambassadors in the form of metal cylinders to be compared to the international one. Each cylinder received a number and a passport of sorts, recording its history of cleaning, transportation, and the rare occasions on which someone dared to touch it with more than their eyes. You can imagine a customs officer asking, "Anything to declare?" And a scientist replying, "Yes, exactly 1 kilogram, and we'd very much like it to stay that way." In everyday life, nobody noticed. People bought a kilogram of potatoes that was in practice. A kilogram, according to a chain of comparisons, from the shop's scale to a calibration weight, from that weight to a regional standard, and so on, back through a bureaucratic ancestry tree until, somewhere far away, a platinum iridium ancestor sat under glass. Most of the time, the chain was more than accurate enough. If the potatoes were slightly more or less than a kilogram, nobody filed an international complaint. Cooks learned to trust their hands instead. But in quiet laboratories, people were measuring more delicate things: chemical reactions, material densities, microscopic samples. For them, the tiny cylinder in France was not potatoes. It was the baseline of reality. Asterisk, of course, reality is stubborn. Over decades, the prototype kilogram and its copies were checked against one another. They were not supposed to change, but the comparisons began to show tiny differences. Copy number 27 might appear heavier by a few micrograms. Number 18 might seem lighter. These numbers are so small that your grocery store scale would shrug and go back to sleep. But in metrology, they were enough to trigger more meetings, more reports, and more diagrams showing sloping lines that ideally should have been flat. It was as if you discovered that your calendar slowly shifts, and every 100 years or so, you have to remove a few minutes from Wednesday. You would still get to the weekend, but someone somewhere would be deeply annoyed. To try to keep the kilogram honest, there was a cleaning ritual. The cylinder was occasionally washed with a mix of solvents and distilled water, then gently polished with a chamois cloth that had a name almost as dignified as the object itself. After the cleaning, the kilogram sometimes weighed slightly less, which caused the kind of philosophical confusion only scientists can fully appreciate. Had it been too heavy before the cleaning? Was it too light afterward? Or had the cleaning cloth, over its many uses, quietly become the world's most important dustbin of mass, containing the sum of tiny particles that no longer counted as standard? Elsewhere, other reference objects led quieter lives. The meter had once been defined by another metal bar, also kept in France, but this bar was eventually retired when scientists adopted a more abstract definition involving the speed of light. Time had long ago left behind actual pendulums in favor of cesium atoms that ticked with microscopic regularity. The poor kilogram, however, remained tied to a physical lump of metal, like the last family member still paying for a landline telephone because it had always been there. As physics moved into the subatomic and the astronomical, the small, slightly smudged cylinder under glass began to feel oddly old-fashioned, like a typewriter in a room full of laptops dot slowly. The idea grew that the kilogram should be redefined, not by a fragile object, but by a constant of nature. This is the scientific version of deciding that, rather than measuring your living room with a tape measure that might stretch, you will from now on define its size in terms of the wavelength of a very reliable beam of light, or the number of meticulously stacked playing cards needed to reach the ceiling. In the case of the kilogram, the would-be constant was the Planck constant, a number from quantum physics that appears whenever light behaves like particles in particles, behave like very small surprises. The Planck constant does not rust, absorb gas, or need polishing. It merely exists, which is convenient. The challenge, though, was translating between the calm world of metal cylinders and the jittery world of quantum constants. Various experiments tried to connect the kilogram to fundamental physics. One especially patient device, the watt balance, later given the friendlier name Kibble balance, compared electrical power to mechanical power with ridiculous precision. Imagine a very fancy seesaw where one side holds a mass and the other side holds carefully measured electricity, and you spend years convincing them to agree. Scientists adjusted currents, monitored magnetic fields, corrected for local gravity, and generally treated the apparatus with the same combination of respect and frustration usually reserved for temperamental pets. And another approach. Researchers grew near-perfect silicon spheres, polished until they were smoother than most thoughts, and counted the atoms inside them using X-rays and equations. Counting atoms is not actually done one by one, of course. That would take too long, even for a sleepy video. Instead, the spacing between atoms is measured, and from that, the number in the whole sphere is inferred. It's a little like estimating how many tiles cover a floor by measuring one tile, and then carefully checking that the tiler never got bored. These spheres glowed under laboratory lights, and their makers spoke about them with fondness. Each sphere was a potential bridge between ordinary weight and the countable universe. All of this took decades of work and many conferences and comfortable hotels where people argued gently about uncertainties and traceability over coffee, while the world outside invented smartphones and social media. The mass community patiently nudged their experiments closer together, making sure different methods gave the same answer within very small tolerances. They were not chasing drama. They were chasing agreement, which is far more difficult and far less exciting to watch. If world politics had been run by metrologists, every treaty would have taken a century to finalize, but would be correct at 8 decimal places. Eventually, the measurements converged. The Planck constant could be written down with enough digits for standards organizations to feel the warm, dull glow of satisfaction. On a particular day chosen in advance, the definition of the kilogram quietly shifted from the mass of that cylinder in France to a derived unit defined by fixing the value of the Planck constant. The cylinder didn't vanish. It remained in its vault, still resting under glass, but it was demoted from being the boss of mass to being an honored retiree. Somewhere a legal document was updated to reflect that, and the world's potatoes remained entirely unaffected. What changed was mostly invisible. Laboratories recalculated their reference values. National standards institutes updated their calibration chains. Somewhere, a technician wrote a note in a logbook saying that from this date forward, the kilogram traceability path would follow a different route, like a train timetable revised to reflect a new junction. Scales in factories and hospitals kept weighing medicine, chemicals, and packages, oblivious to the philosophical shift underneath them. The people who noticed were those who cared about weather measurement. Uncertainty was 5 parts in 10 million or 3 parts in 10 million. For them, this was not a revolution. It was a quiet improvement in the wallpaper of reality. Yet the image of that original cylinder, sitting under nested bell jars, remains oddly comforting. There is something very human about pointing to an object and saying, "This, exactly this, is our reference." It is the same instinct that keeps childhood measuring marks on a doorframe, even after everyone has grown taller and moved away. The cylinder represents a time when the physical world and our definitions of it were allowed to be almost the same thing. As long as somebody remembered to dust, if you are still listening, you might picture the vault now, late at night. The corridor is quiet, the lights are low. Behind a heavy door, inside a safe, under layers of glass, the former master kilogram rests on its pedestal. Nobody needs to consult it anymore to know what a kilogram is, yet the cylinder keeps existing with the same patient mass it always had. It doesn't care about Planck constants, watt balances, or silicon spheres. It simply sits and weighs, and gathers a negligible amount of whatever time leaves on metal dot around the world. Its once loyal copies continue their service. They are still used to calibrate weights, to test balances, to give students in metrology courses something reassuringly solid to look at. Every so often, someone opens a case, lifts a bell jar, and checks that everything is as expected. The report will say that within the limits of measurement, the standard remains stable. The person who writes it might think briefly about the long chain of comparisons stretching back through decades and forward into future audits. Then they will close the case, lock the cabinet, turn out the light, and leave the kilogram alone again with the darkness and the dust dot in the end. The story of the kilogram is not about dramatic discoveries. It is about people slowly agreeing on what the same means when nothing is ever perfectly identical, and about the small rituals that hold that agreement together. It is about cleaning a metal cylinder with a special cloth, not because anyone will notice if you don't, but because you promise that this, of all objects, would be cared for precisely. It is about the patience to measure the world so carefully that the world itself begins to seem drowsy. Somewhere tonight, a scale display flickers from 999.999 grams to 1000.000 and back again, undecided for a moment before settling. Nobody will stay awake to celebrate that last digit. They will close the notebook, turn off the instrument, and go home. The standard kilogram, demoted but dignified, will sleep on. And as you drift towards sleep yourself, you can imagine that somewhere under glass, a small metal cylinder is keeping very quiet company with the weight of everything you've decided to put down for the night. You might not think the world could spend more than a century quietly negotiating the size of a sheet of paper, but it did. While wars came and went, empires rose and reorganized themselves. Committees of very calm people sat in very beige rooms and argued in quite a polite way about whether 297 millimeters was truly the right length for something called A4. Tonight, we are going to walk through that long hallway of paperwork. No explosions, no betrayals, just a slow procession of rectangles. If you're somehow still awake by the time we reach the part where they debate the ideal corner radius for punched files, you're welcome to subscribe. But honestly, if the paper sizes put you to sleep before that, the system is working perfectly. You probably know one or two sizes by heart without meaning to. A 4, maybe. Or, depending on where you live, something called letter, which sounds friendly, like a note from a friend, but is actually a relic of 19th century printing habits. You might have an instinctive sense of how it feels to fold an A4 sheet in half for a small booklet, or how awkward it is to fit a letter-sized page into a European folder, where it sulks with a few millimeters of stubborn overhang. These small annoyances are the fossils of earlier choices. Once, every country had its own favorite rectangles: foolscap, brief, post, demi, royal. Stationers cataloged them like rare birds. Printers memorized them. Clerks simply accepted that a sheet ordered in London might not get along with a file ordered in Munich in the 18th and early 19th centuries. The size of paper often came down to the frame of the mold used to scoop pulp from a vat. A papermaker would build a wooden frame, weave a mesh of wires, and that shape became crown or double crown, or some other noble name. There was a rough consistency within each meld, but no real harmony between them. It was like everyone playing the same song in slightly different keys. Governments tried, occasionally, to set rules. A decree might declare that legal documents must be written on sheets of a specified dimension, usually something tall and slightly narrow, good for long sentences and complicated signatures. But neighboring regions made their own decrees. Nobody coordinated. International trade meant that merchants accumulated stacks of almost the same paper that didn't quite match. The office equivalent of socks that look identical until you try to pair them. As printing grew more industrial, the inconvenience became harder to ignore. Factories wanted to cut large rolls into standard formats. Newspapers wanted predictable columns. Engineers wanted plans that could be folded into known envelopes. Around the turn of the 20th century, a German engineer and scientist named Walter Porstmann began to look at paper in a more mathematical way. Instead of starting with whatever mold happened to exist, he asked a different question. What if each size were simply half of the previous one? And if the proportions stayed the same when you folded it? This is the quiet beginning of the A series, the family that would eventually give us a 4. The shape he chose has sides in the ratio of 1 to the square root of 2. It sounds dramatic, but it's actually very relaxing. When you cut a rectangle with that ratio in half along its short side, each half still has the same proportions. The paper clones itself, just smaller, like a calm geometric Matryoshka doll. The beauty of this system is not in any deep philosophical meaning. It's in small conveniences. If a printer works with a huge sheet about the size of a modest dining table, they know that folding or cutting it will produce a 1, a 2, all the way down to a 4 and beyond. Enlarging or shrinking on a photocopier becomes as simple as choosing 71% or 141%. For office workers, none of this needs to be written down. Their hands simply learn that a 4 folded once becomes a 5, the default size for meeting notes that nobody will reread. Somewhere, though, in a standards office in early 20th century Berlin, somebody did write it down with equations and tolerances and diagrams. They gave the system a formal name, DIN 476. They gave each size a tolerance of plus, or minus 1.5 millimeters, to accommodate the fact that real paper, unlike equations, is inclined to curl. Germany adopted the DIN sizes in the 1920s, which means that, quietly, a lot of paperwork suddenly began to line up. Government forms, business letters, school notebooks, all started to respect the powers of 2. The rest of Europe watched, perhaps with mild curiosity, perhaps with the resigned expression of someone who suspects that, sooner or later, they will have to buy new folders. Over the decades, more countries experimented with the system. Some did it all at once by decree. Others allowed both old and new formats to coexist in office drawers. There were, briefly, compromises. Stationery that offered both an A4 ruling and a faint guide for older sizes. Shelves that fit either format as long as you tilted the older one slightly and didn't look too closely. Printing technology also nudged the change along, with offset printing and standardized presses. It was simply easier if everyone agreed that a sheet called a 2 would be exactly half of a 1. Posters, instruction leaflets, railway timetables, and exam papers could all be derived from the same parent size. During the mid-20th century, as international organizations multiplied, the need for shared norms grew. Engineers exchanging drawings, bureaucrats exchanging forms, publishers exchanging manuscripts, everybody gained a little convenience when the rectangles matched. It was like discovering that all the plugs in your house finally fit all the sockets without adapters. Not thrilling, but quietly satisfying. In the 1970s, the International Organization for Standardization took up the German system and gave it a broader passport as ISO 216. A 4 became the official standard size for business letters in most of the world. A 3 became the noble sheet for medium-sized posters and spreadsheets that refused to fit in ordinary columns. A 5 remained the polite notebook size, especially good for meeting minutes and thoughts you intend to lose later. Some countries adopted the ISO system wholeheartedly. Others kept it alongside older habits. The transition was rarely dramatic. There were no protests in the streets about paper ratios. At most, a clerk might sigh as they realized their supply of older forms no longer matched the envelopes now available. Of course, not everyone converted. The United States and Canada, among others, continued to favor their own traditional sizes: letter, legal, ledger. Letter is slightly wider and slightly shorter than a 4, like a cousin who wears similar clothes but insists on rolling up the sleeves. Legal size, taller and narrow, carries the faint air of documents that don't know when to stop talking. This divergence means that international offices often have 2 sets of everything, 2 stacks of paper, 2 kinds of folders, 2 types of storage boxes. Somewhere, a multinational company's stationery cupboard tells the whole story, of 4 reams on one shelf, letter on the other, coexisting like neighboring species that have agreed not to compete directly. The difference in size is small, yet it has practical rituals. A European trying to print an American PDF on A4 will see the printer apologize politely with a fit-to-page message, shrinking the text by a few %. An American working with an A4 document on letter paper finds the bottom line of text perilously close to the edge, like someone standing near the last step of a staircase. Designers who prepare global reports sometimes keep both formats in mind, leaving generous margins that can absorb the mismatch. This is the very soft kind of international tension, nobody is offended, but a few charts look slightly uncomfortable dot within the A series, smaller wonders appear. A 6 is the size of a postcard. A 7 is a ticket that seems perfectly designed to be forgotten in a jacket pocket. On the borderlands of the system, specialized sizes bloom, C-series envelopes, which are just big enough to hold their A-series cousins. B-series sheets, used for posters and books that want to be a little more spacious. You don't have to remember any of this, yet your hands probably know it. They know how many times to fold a sheet so it fits into a standard envelope. They know that in a 3-sheet folded to a 4 feels like something important, a certificate, maybe, or an official notice, while a 4 folded to a 5 feels like a flyer inviting you to a meeting with biscuits dot around all this. There's the quieter story of margins and hole punches. Once A4 became dominant, the distance from the edge of the paper to the vertical line of holes needed to be agreed as well, so that any punched sheet could find a home in any ring binder. Standards crept into that space too. The 2-hole system, common in some countries, placed its holes at a measured distance. The 4-hole system, more secure, added 2 more, like extra reassurance that no page would escape. Somewhere a committee decided that the top margin should be high, enough to accommodate headers and staples, but not so high as to waste paper. It is an entire micro-universe of agreements you never see, yet you use every day when you push a document into a folder and it slides in as if it always belonged there, if you are still awake. You might imagine an ordinary office late at night, the lights mostly off, the photocopier asleep. On a desk lies a single sheet of A4 unused, its pale surface divided by faint manufacturing lines you can't quite see. Its dimensions, 210 by 297 millimeters, carry the memory of all those meetings, standards, and quiet arguments, but the sheet itself doesn't know that. It only knows that if someone folds it exactly in half, it will produce a 5 and then a 6, each fold stacking a century of decisions into your fingertips. You might scribble a shopping list on it or draft a letter that never gets sent. You might crumple it and throw it away, slightly missing the bin. None of that changes the fact that millions of its siblings all around the world are living almost exactly the same life. The history of paper sizes has no heroic climax. There's no final battle where A4 triumphs over letter in dramatic fashion. There is only the slow settling of habits modeled by printers and photocopiers and the shelves in stationery shops. Children grow up tracing their homework on sheets that just happen to follow the square root of 2 ratio, and they never wonder why folding works so neatly. Office workers travel between countries and notice, perhaps with mild amusement, that their favorite folders don't quite fit in other filing cabinets. Librarians catalog volumes that measure 210 by 297 millimeters or 216 by 279. And the books sit quietly side by side anyway, Dot, so as your eyes grow heavier, you can let your mind drift to that gentle geometry. Rectangles nesting within rectangles. A O halved into a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, like a family tree written in millimeters. Somewhere, a standards document lists all these sizes with tolerances and notes and a revision date that nobody celebrates. Somewhere else, a hand reaches for a blank sheet without thinking about ratio or history, and the paper simply offers itself, ready to be folded, printed on, or left perfectly empty. And somewhere between those two places, between the committees and the quiet desks, you can drift off. knowing that, at least on the subject of rectangles, a surprisingly large part of the world managed to agree on something and then stop talking about it and just let the paper rest. You might not expect a row of tiny numbers on a book spine to be the result of more than a century of gentle argument, but here we are. Those little labels in the library, the ones that read things like 823.912 well or 635.9 gar, they look so sure of themselves. Calm, rectangular, slightly yellowed. Tonight we're going to follow those numbers very slowly. From the moment when libraries first tried to decide where to put everything, to the moment when a book finally comes to rest on a shelf and quietly gathers dust. It's not a story with twists. It's more like watching someone alphabetize a very large sock drawer. If you're still awake by the time we drift into the section on folklore, usually around 398.2, you're welcome to subscribe. But honestly, it's perfectly fine if you fall asleep somewhere in the geography aisle and never make it back. A long time ago, in the days when books were rare and expensive and occasionally chained to the furniture like nervous parrots, shelving was simple. A monastery might have only a few dozen volumes. They were stored in cupboards or on lecterns, and the classification system was basically put the Bible where you can see it and everything else somewhere near it. Titles were recorded in handwritten catalogs that resembled shopping lists without prices. As collections grew, people tried various methods, arranging books by size, by language, by donor, by the color of the binding. Size shelving made the room look tidy, with all the tall folios standing together like a line of very serious soldiers. But it did not help anyone who wanted to find all the books on, say, agriculture. Arranging by donor made rich patrons feel important, but it meant that botany, astronomy, and sermons could end up living side by side just because the same duke paid for them by the 17th and 18th centuries. Some libraries began to think in terms of subjects. Theology here, law there, medicine in a slightly separate corner in case of diagrams. Shelves were sometimes labeled with painted words, history, poetry, science. Within each section, books were still often placed by size because gravity has opinions, and heavy volumes prefer lower shelves. Call numbers, where they existed at all, were usually tied to the physical location. Press 3, Shelf 2, Book 5. It worked as long as the library stayed the same size. But each time a new book arrived, someone had to decide whether to squeeze it in, move everything along, or create a new little offshoot section with a label like History Misc New. Over decades, this produced a kind of fossil record of decisions. You could walk down an aisle and see where the library had run out of space in 1823. Because suddenly the call numbers jumped from press 7 to Annex 1 in the 19th century. As printing became faster and cheaper, libraries swelled. Public libraries opened their doors to people who did not wear academic robes. Suddenly, it was not enough to know that a book lived on the philosophy shelf. You needed a way to fit thousands upon thousands of volumes into order, and to keep that order even when new books arrived every week. Several librarians tried to solve this quietly alarming problem. One of them, a young American named Melville Dewey, looked at the situation and decided that words were too messy. Numbers, he thought, could be stretched infinitely, with decimals and decimals of decimals, like a polite line that never ran out of space because you could always fit somebody. Between 100.1 and 100.2. Dewey's idea was simple, in the way that only a very organized mind finds simple. All of knowledge would be divided into 10 broad classes, 000 for general works, 100 for philosophy, 200 for religion, and so on, all the way to 900 for history and geography. Each class would be subdivided into 10 divisions, and each division into 10 sections. 3 digits gave you a basic address: 823 for English fiction, 641 for food and drink, 512 for algebra. After that, the decimal point opened the door to all sorts of finer distinctions. Fairy tales, 398.2. Indoor games, 793. All you had to do was assign a number to each topic, like giving every idea its own street address. The quiet genius of this system was that the shelves only needed to respect the order of numbers. A book labeled 641.5 would follow, 641.4, and precede 641.6. When a new book on French pastries arrived, you didn't need to repaint the shelves or invent a new press. You just examined its subject: desserts, French, baking, and worked out a number that fit somewhere in the existing chain. Perhaps 641.86. The decimals could stretch as far as you liked, 641.8653 if necessary. It is hard to imagine anyone staying awake while arguing whether cakes deserve 0.86 or 0.87. But professional catalogers have done exactly that. Libraries began adopting Dewey numbers slowly, then more quickly. Some loved the apparent neatness. Others raised an eyebrow at the philosophical choices embedded in the numbers. For example, religion occupied a full 100 numbers, 200 to 299, but Christianity took up most of that space, with other faiths squeezed politely into the final decimal corners. Geography and history were entangled at 900, which meant that travelers and historians often bumped elbows on the same shelves. Still, the practical advantages were hard to ignore. Patrons could browse by subject rather than by donor. A person interested in gardening, sent to the 635s, would find a little forest of related titles rather than a single lonely manual. While Dewey's decimals were taking off, other systems developed their own followers. In the United States, large research libraries favored the Library of Congress classification, a letter-based scheme designed by, unsurprisingly, the Library of Congress. Here, broad subjects received letters instead of hundreds: Q for science, N for art, K for law. Numbers refine the topics, and additional letters trim them even further. A book on 19th century French painting might wear a spine label like ND547F8, a string that looks random until you learn its internal grammar. The strength of this system was its flexibility. New fields could be inserted by adding more combinations of letters and numbers. The weakness, from the perspective of someone staring sleepily at a shelf, is that it feels like being handed a secret code and told you have a quiz tomorrow. Across the Atlantic, other schemes blossomed. In Britain, Henry Bliss proposed yet another classification method, slightly more philosophical in its arrangement, hoping to reflect what he saw as the natural order of knowledge. Some specialized libraries, law, medicine, music, crafted their own systems, carefully tuned to their users. A medical textbook might be filed under QZ 123 in one library and 617.4 in another. The books themselves did not mind. They sat quietly wherever they were put. But librarians who cared deeply about such things attended conferences where they compared not only circulation statistics, but also the virtues of different numbering systems, often with the level of passion other people reserved for sports. As systems spread, they generated little local customs. A public library might adopt Dewey, but decide to move all fiction into a separate fixed section, because readers preferred to browse by author rather than by 813.6. Children's departments sometimes simplified numbers, using bright stickers and categories like dinosaurs or trucks, instead of 567.9 or 629.2. Because 4-year-olds are notoriously unimpressed by decimal hierarchy. Academic libraries, on the other hand, often leaned in the opposite direction, adding more codes to distinguish languages, editions, and formats. A book on Shakespeare might carry not just its classification number, but also a cutter number, usually a short code derived from the author's name plus a year of publication, and occasionally a volume number. The result looks something like PR2894, C3 1998 Volume 2, which is less a label and more a full postal address. Including apartment and floor dot, behind each spine label lies a trail of quiet labor. When a new book arrives, it doesn't simply stroll onto the shelf. It passes through cataloging, where someone examines its title page, reads the summary, glances at the table of contents, and decides what the book is essentially about. This sounds simple until you consider a work like Snails and Medieval French Poetry. Is it literature? Zoology? Cultural history? Somewhere, a cataloger must decide whether it joins its friends in French literature, in which case it hides among hundreds of other monographs, or whether it ventures bravely into a tiny cluster of books on mollusks. That decision becomes a call number, penciled lightly in the book before being printed on the label. To the casual reader, it's just a string. To the cataloger, it's a compromise between several plausible worlds. Over time, the systems themselves evolve. New fields appear: computer science, environmental studies, data science, graphic novels. Older schemes like Dewey did not originally include them in detail, so librarians had to improvise, nudging topics into nearby categories. Early books on computing, for example, were often shelved under 1.64, data processing, a description that feels gently underwhelming in the age of smartphones. As the decades passed, revisions were published. Whole ranges were renumbered. In some libraries, books bearing older call numbers still occupy their places, tiny time capsules of earlier understandings. You can trace the rise of a discipline by watching its numbers move, from the corners of general science into its own carved-out niche. Like a tenant eventually acquiring a dedicated mailbox, there are also the small human rebellions. A librarian might decide that a certain topic is heavily used and deserves a more prominent place, even if the numbers say otherwise. Local history materials, technically belonging in the 900s, might receive pride of place near the entrance. Cookbooks might be pulled from their 641, 5 South to an open, low shelf where they tempt passing readers with glossy photos. Sometimes patron behavior drives these adjustments. If everyone asks for travel guides at the desk, it may be easier to cluster them visibly, never mind what the classification tables say. In these cases, the call number remains on the spine, but the shelving hints gently that systems exist to be bent. For readers, the experience of call numbers is more tactile than intellectual. You glance at your slip of paper, say, 398.2 Graeber, and wander to the correct aisle. At first, the numbers feel random. 398.21, 398.22, 398.23. Then you realize they are all variations on folktales and legends. One shelf might hold collections of fairy tales from Scandinavia, the next from Japan, the next studies of motifs that compare, in alarming detail, the frequency of talking animals versus magical objects. Standing there, you can feel the logic of classification as a kind of gravitational field. Once you know roughly where you are, nearby books are probably about similar things, even if the decimals differ. Browse a little to the left, a little to the right, and you find texts you did not know existed. The social life of trolls, pumpkins in European oral tradition, the symbolism of shoes. There is something soothing about this predictability. In a chaotic world, the 800s will always be literature. The 300s will always hide sociology and politics. The 500s will cradle natural sciences. Even when libraries reorganize, they do so slowly, one shelf at a time, with signs warning patrons that the 700s have moved downstairs. Nothing dramatic sneaks up on you. You will never find astrophysics suddenly embedded in cookery. If you do, it is probably a misshelved book, and many library users take quiet pleasure in correcting such anomalies. Sliding a lost volume back to its rightful numeric home dot as evening deepens, it's easy to imagine the library closing. Lights dim, computers whir softly into sleep, and the last patrons drift out with stacks of books pressed to their chests. The shelves remain tall and patient. Every spine label is still there, tiny white rectangles aligned like teeth in a very orderly mouth. Call numbers face the aisle, ready for tomorrow. In the silence, the logic knitted into those sequences does a kind of slow breathing of its own. 1002-003, all the way to 999. It's not a perfect map of human knowledge. There are cultural biases, outdated assumptions, awkward gaps. But as a bedtime companion, it's oddly reassuring. You know that if you pull a book from 551, it will talk about geology, not gossip dot somewhere. A new standard is being drafted to handle digital resources, ebooks, streaming media. There will be debates about whether these need physical call numbers at all, or only virtual ones in catalogs. Committees will argue politely about how to classify podcasts or interactive data sets. Yet on the shelf, the old labels keep doing their job without complaint. Ink doesn't know about metadata. It simply sits there saying, this is 823.912, or this is 635.9, a quiet set of coordinates in millimeters in cardboard. If your eyes are heavy now, you can let them close and picture a single aisle. Perhaps you're standing somewhere around 910, the travel section, or 940, European history. The fluorescent lights buzz softly overhead. The air carries a faint scent of paper, dust, and plastic covers. You run a finger along the tops of the books and feel the slight variation where one volume is a few millimeters taller than the next. Behind you, unseen entire worlds of classification continue. Biographies at 920, mathematics at 510, birds at 598. Every number is a promise that somewhere on that shelf, the topic you're curious about has found a home. The books are not in a hurry. They will be there tomorrow and next week, and probably long after the cataloging rules change again dot, so you can let the numbers drift out of focus. 398.2 becomes just a blur of white. 641.5 softens at the edges. The order on the shelves continues whether or not you're paying attention. All those committees, all those printed tables and revised editions have done their work so that you don't have to think about them. You can simply reach out someday and find a book where its call number says it should be. For now, though, the shelves are quiet, the labels rest, and the decimals stretch on into the dark like a very gentle, very organized lullaby. You might not think the question, "What time is it?" could start an international paperwork adventure, but it did, very politely, over more than 100 years. Before clocks agreed with one another, time was something you mostly measured by the sun, by the length of a shadow, or by the vague feeling that cows probably wanted to be milked. Tonight, we're going to follow the very slow story of how the world decided to slice the day into numbered zones. How some countries chose to be 30 minutes different just because they could, and how one October night a few railway clerks had to print timetables for an hour that technically never happened. It is not an exciting story. That's the good part dot in the beginning. There was local time, which is exactly what it sounds like. Noon was when the sun stood highest over your own town. If the next town was a little to the east, their noon arrived a few minutes earlier. The place to the west had to wait a bit longer. Nobody minded, because the distance between towns was measured in horses and tired feet. Arriving in the afternoon meant any vaguely bright period between lunch and sunset. You didn't need to know whether it was 3:07 or 3:18 if you're still awake when we finally get to the international conference about this. You're welcome to subscribe or adjust your own personal time zone by 5 minutes as a symbolic gesture. Either way, no forms are required. As clocks became more precise and more portable, people started noticing that time could be annoyingly specific. Pocket watches ticked away in waistcoat pockets. Church towers got minute hands instead of just hours. A shop might post opening times like 8 till 6, which meant the owner had to glance up at the steeple now and then and pretend to care about punctuality. Still, your town's official time was just town time. In London, it was Greenwich time, based on the observatory. In Bristol, to the west, noon arrived about 10 minutes later. Some shops solved this by putting up 2 clocks, one for each, a kind of early dual monitor setup. One clock showed Bristol time, the other London time, and nobody felt this was excessive. Then railways arrived and did what trains always do. They insisted on schedules. A horse can leave when it's ready. A steam locomotive demands a timetable that says precisely when it departs and when it arrives, down to the minute, because coal, water, and impatient passengers are involved. Suddenly, afternoon was not specific enough. Companies printed great folding sheets of departure times, and it quickly became impractical if every station used its own local time. A train that left one town at 2 o'clock and arrived at another town at 1:54 looked worryingly like it had traveled backwards, which, despite rumors, most trains did not. The simplest solution was to pick one time and force everyone along the line to respect it. In Britain, the railways quietly adopted Greenwich time, and stations set their clocks to match. Local noon still existed for people who cared about the sun's feelings, but the trains cared more about Greenwich. In North America, things were messier. Each city clung to its own local time, and by the late 19th century, there were literally dozens of official times counted across the continent. At one point, a traveler consulting various timetables might juggle more than 50 different local times on a single journey, which was the horological equivalent of carrying a bag of mismatched socks. Railroad companies grew tired of this and designed their own unofficial time zones, like people rearranging furniture before the landlord approves. On a November day in 1883, American and Canadian railroads executed what they called the Day of Two Noons, which sounds dramatic but mainly involved telegraph operators resetting clocks. At precisely an agreed-upon moment, time was nudged to fit into 4 broad zones, each 1 hour apart: Eastern, Central, Mountain, Pacific. In some towns, the official town clock jumped forward or back by several minutes. There were no explosions, only a few mildly annoyed people who suspected the day had been shortened or lengthened without their consent. Governments, noticing that the railways had quietly solved the problem, eventually followed suit. But the world still needed a way to coordinate these zones globally. Enter a conference in Washington, D.C. in 1884, where delegates from more than 20 countries gathered to decide, very politely, which meridian should be prime. They chose Greenwich, in part because a large number of ships already used it for navigation, and in part because the alternative arguing for every capital's own longitude would have required several extra months of tea breaks. The conference did not force anyone to adopt time zones. It merely drew a neat imaginary grid and suggested that hours could be counted away from this central line, 1 hour for each 15 degrees of longitude. It was like giving the world a blank form and saying, "You may fill this in at your leisure." Many countries did adopt zones close to these suggested lines, but not all. Some decided that being exactly 1 hour off felt too tidy. India, for instance, settled on a half-hour offset, now UTC 5:30, compromising between cities and making sure that neither felt overly favored. Nepal went even further and chose a 15-minute difference from its large neighbor, ending up at UTC 5:45, as if to prove that the decimal part of time could also express national character. In Newfoundland, a half-hour offset separated the island from mainland Canada, a useful reminder that ferries require slightly different patience than trains. These decisions might sound arbitrary, and that is because they are. Time, in these cases, is an expression not only of longitude, but also of local pride. Once the idea of zones caught on, people had to adjust their daily routines. In some places, the official change came with almost no ceremony. A notice appeared in the newspaper. From Sunday next, clocks will be put on minutes to conform with the new standard. In others, there were debates. Farmers worried that cows would not appreciate the sudden shift, though cows, being more concerned with daylight than with clock faces, adjusted in their own bovine way. Schools sent reminders to parents that classes would still start at 8, even if 8 now meant something slightly different. The sun, indifferent, continued to rise and set whenever it liked. As if zones were not enough, some countries later embraced daylight saving time, which is essentially the practice of borrowing an hour from the early morning in order to spend it in the evening, and then returning it in the autumn with the weary air of librarians shelving a misplaced book. The idea was to make better use of daylight, particularly during wartime in higher latitudes. In practice, it mainly produced twice-yearly rituals of clock-twisting, bleary commuters, and at least one person who proudly claimed to ignore the whole thing and live on real time, by which they meant whatever their bedside alarm refused to update itself to. The mechanics of changing clocks can be quietly strange. In many countries, the autumn shift involves repeating 1 hour. 1 o'clock in the morning arrives, passes, and then arrives again, like a guest who forgot their umbrella and came back. Timetables mark this carefully. Trains scheduled during the repeat hour must specify whether they depart in the first 1:30 or the second 1:30. The spring change does the opposite. An hour is skipped. Clocks jump from 1:59 to 3 o'clock, and officially nothing at all happens between. Somewhere in railway archives lay records for trains scheduled in that missing slice of time, recorded with asterisks and explanatory footnotes, proof that you can, at least on paper, travel through an hour that never statistically existed. Meanwhile, the underlying global system coordinated universal time, or UT, ticks away quietly, anchored to atomic clocks that measure the vibrations of cesium atoms with a level of attention no human can maintain without coffee. In theory, UTC keeps perfect time. In practice, the Earth itself is not perfectly punctual. Its rotation wobbles slightly. To account for this, every so often a leap second is added, usually at the end of June or December. At 23 hours, 59 minutes, and 59 seconds, the next tick is not YY but an extra D. Y, a moment that feels made up but is entirely official. Some computer systems dislike this surprise and sulk. Most people do not notice. If you ever wanted a scientifically sanctioned extra second of sleep, you may already have taken it without realizing. All these layers, local time, standard time, daylight saving shifts, leap seconds rest on top of a very simple human need to know when to be somewhere at the same moment as someone else. Before telegraphs and trains, synchronization was loose. You arrived around sunset or before the bell. Now, meetings start at 9 o'clock sharp. Video calls connect 3 continents, and phone clocks adjust themselves invisibly using signals from towers and satellites. Yet the structure beneath remains the old lattice of zones centered on a convention agreed in the 19th century, with its offsets, its quirks, its half hours and quarter hours that show where geography and politics shook hands a little awkwardly. If tonight you check your phone, you'll see your current time zone given a code, perhaps GMT or CET, or something with a plus sign and a number. Behind that small label lies a whole history of committees, telegraph clicks, train schedules, and maps with vertical lines drawn on them in ink. You do not need to think about any of it. Your alarm will ring tomorrow when you told it to. Flights will depart according to airport screens that may show 3 different times, all somehow correct: local time, departure time elsewhere, and the timeless UTC used by air traffic control. Ships at sea often keep their own ship's time, changing the clocks gradually as they cross longitudes, so the crew doesn't suddenly eat lunch at what their bodies insist is breakfast. You can let all of that continue without you for a while. Imagine a world map in the dark, faintly glowing along the edges where cities lie. Time zones wrap around it like soft ribbons, sometimes straight, sometimes crooked, to follow borders or coastlines or old political agreements. In one place, midnight has just struck. In another, people are making tea at 5 p.m. In a third, someone yawns in a library at 11 in the morning, wondering vaguely why their lecture feels like it's happening an hour too early and blaming daylight saving time. The planet turns steadily, ignoring the lines we drew, but the lines remain, holding our schedules together. Eventually, your own time will reach whatever hour you've decided is late. The numbers on your screen will change at their usual pace, 1 minute, then another. No conferences are needed, no telegraphs, no leap seconds tonight. You can close your eyes knowing that somewhere, a handful of very accurate atomic clocks are staying awake on your behalf, humming gently, keeping the world lined up in hours and minutes. The arguments about what to do with the next leap second can wait for daylight. For now, the zones stretch quietly around the globe, and you're free to drift through them, off the map, into the kind of sleep where time no longer needs to be measured at all.